and I think circulars are coming on an average more than one circular a day, and with now new team getting taken over at the ministry level. Each and every questions are being discussed, and in the morning itself there was a circular. There's a funny provision that duplicate share certificates need to be approved at the board level. Now we are, let's say for example, auditors of a very big company, and we approve their duplicate share certificates. So the question was thrown to us that do we need to circulate each and every duplicate case to the board? Because knowingly or unknowingly, the definition of board in 2013 Act doesn't include committees. In 1956 Act, board includes board committees, but similar definition is not there. So an interpretation was thrown that since board no longer includes committees, all the approvals which are kind of put up for the board, they have to be necessarily approved at the board level, including issue of duplicate certificates. Fortunately, there is a circular in the morning. Again, they have not addressed the micro level concept of board including board committee, but they have given on this very specific point that duplicate share certificate can continue to be approved by the board or any of the committee. So that's the kind of speed of clarification. Of course, there are a lot of gaps, as some of which we have discussed. When we talk of implementation, Companies Act is of course one piece of legislation, but we need to have a lot of other standards, rules, policies mixed with it in terms of standards, because now secretarial standards are also made mandatory. Again, we have to map what is there in the secretarial standard and what is there in the Companies Act, and stricter of the two we have to finally take for our implementation. Rules, of course, there are series of rules. Now, a lot of times I stress upon a point that a company like Reliance, again and again I am taking an example of Reliance, not for anything else, but probably I have worked with Reliance. Think of a company like Reliance, which has offices across, which have plants across, which have corporate office. Agreements, third-party agreements, which are entered into with, let's say, various levels of delegated authority. There are a lot of governance sitting in those agreements. That company agrees to do this, company agrees not to do this. How do they ensure that once those agreements are, let's say, entered in some office somewhere in Jamnagar, how does the corporate team sitting out here ensure that yes, this corporate restructuring is proposed, but then probably those aspects are missed out. So I think this is an opportunity where we implement the new Companies Act. We need to think of what all do's and don'ts have been agreed by the company and whether those do's and don'ts are in line with the Companies Act. If not, probably we need to streamline, otherwise we may be in for a serious trouble, if not now, down the line somewhere. The entire Companies Act, the way we look at, I think it can be broken down into two pieces in terms of what are those ongoing compliances by virtue of being a company, whichever way, private, public, and then those event specific or corporate action specific in terms of mergers, amalgamations, buyback, restructuring. So whenever those corporate actions are proposed, then there is a set of provisions come in play, and those have to be read with, along with accounting standards, tax provisions, listing agreement in case of listed company, and sectoral regulation in case of insurance, telecom, etc., etc. And then third category is periodic compliance, every quarter, every half year, every year, and that's how probably we need to map all the compliances in terms of ongoing, in terms of periodic, and in terms of based on a particular action. There are a lot of checkpoints. Of course, every section has to be kind of looked at afresh. There are, let's say, checkpoints which runs into tens of points for a particular section. So if we are, let's say, dealing with 188, 186, 185 in terms of related party, loan to director, etc., etc., First of all, we need to understand the group structure. Who holds where and who holds what? Who are the common directors? Whether relatives are on the board, whether it's a normal transaction. Even in wholly owned subsidiary, the exemption which we have talked about, this is subject to the funds being utilized by the company for its principal business activity. Now, what is principal business activity? Does that mean that holding company cannot fund a subsidiary for diversification, which as on the date of funding is not principal business activity of the company? But naturally, genuinely, it's a business transaction for business purpose. But I think we need to wait for what do they really mean by principal business activity. So like that, we need to kind of find out the problem areas, take a particular call, and go about it in terms of compliance so that we don't fall foul of any significant non-compliance. Because penalties are huge. Again, they have probably matched with the rates of real estate in Mumbai or probably the finding the penalties of city. So even non-filing of forms, etc., the penalty runs into lakhs of rupees. So gone will be the days, or gone are the days probably where we take individual of form file kar denge 500 rupees to the manager. So probably that will no longer work because the penalty starts from lakhs. And again, in addition to the company, they have specific provision on penalties for professionals. And you will be surprised to know, those who have probably skipped, Ministry has issued a circular, an internal circular, that whichever disclosure which is being filed under the Companies Act, if it is certified by any professional, CA, CWA, CS, there will be a scrutiny every fortnight by Ministry suo motu. And if they find any irregularity, they will start kind of questioning and whatever proceedings against the professional. So that's, to that extent, probably the law has kind of stretched, and some of the findings of audits, annual returns, the penalty starts from 1,50,000. So the very filing fee will probably be much lesser than the minimum penalty level. So we need to be very careful if at all we practice in those areas. So before certifying or endorsing any particular document, return or disclosure, we need to have our working notes done properly and justification, background papers kind of kept in the file. So in terms of implementation, we need to understand, identify areas of convergence which are very kind of hard to put in the slide. So I have captured only the pointers. And believe me, the reason is not merely commercial, but necessarily the time constraint and the discussion what we have at our disposal. Impact analysis, each and every provision, what and in what terms it impacts the corporate, the staff, the team, the transactions. And finally bifurcating into what is doable, what is totally prohibited, and what is doable with, let's say, procedure. What modifications we need to have, what we need to stop, and what we need to necessarily start. So all those mapping in terms of compliances we need to do, and again that need to be mapped in terms of ongoing, periodic, and event basis. So there has to be kind of a chart which is leading to all these categories or subcategories in every relevant kind of compliance box, and that's where probably, and then again we need to link up with that with our tax provisions and accounting norms. So the overall action plan would be to have the convergence program, have specific granular kind of action plan for key compliances. One of the questions was thrown to me. I will take corollary example, not necessarily that very illustration. You must have heard this concept of each of all of ITC. The concept is very simple, that they give computers to village farmers, and that by that interface they have all the information of weather, seeds availability, farm, etc., and that help them increase their productivity, that reduces the importance or involvement of middlemen, and they fetch better pricing both in terms of their seeds, etc., and also at the final output level. And that produce is purchased by ITC for their foods division, dal, bara, etc., biscuits, Ashirwad Atta. Now, is it CSR or is it a kind of business activity? Hindustan Liver, for example, they distribute water purifiers to village. Some village they have adopted at a discounted price. So the margins which they forego, whether that's CSR or it is kind of a promotional activity and part of their business activity. And that's why I think these questions trigger a thought that can we optimize our CSR spend? Because some of the bigger companies CSR spend runs into crores of rupees. So does it mean that they need to have additional spend, or they can consider some of these spends as part of CSR, so they are not out of pocket in terms of additional CSR spend? So the call is, if the intention of that CSR spend, if the intention of the spend is benevolent, if the purpose is let's say helping the poor, even if it is linked to the business activity, it could be termed as CSR. So we need to really find out those areas, read in between the lines, and then probably help the strategy part that these are probably can be done in CSR, these are completely not included, or these are included with some kind of modification. So that's the kind of, that is the level or extent of involvement which we need to have. I have another 10-15 minutes. Maybe 2 last slides and then I'll conclude, and then of course if any suggestions, feedback, questions, inputs. The way I look at 10 key action points, again I must mention very general, very broad, but probably that's how they are, that's how they should be. We were appointed by one of the companies that to help us in our first board meeting and general meeting, and they had a belief that they had probably done the right kind of exercise. It's kind of a revalidation. 29 points, and I don't claim that those points are exhaustive. Whether it is noting, whether that is affirmation, whether that is linked to your accounts, your tax practices, there are a lot of provisions. One example would be, which is of course not written by the team here, is that your borrowing limits, you need to have them ratified by the board and shareholders, otherwise you cannot use them. So we might be wondering that we have the limits and our borrowing is under the limits, but there are a lot of places, even provision C, endorsement, ratification, approval, whichever name we give to our existing transaction limits, and we need to be very careful of taking those approvals in place, otherwise probably we may invite some kind of problem. Governance structure is the second area. So one is items for board, whether at the first meeting, second meeting, or going forward. That is one exercise which we need to do. Second is governance structure. Right from composition of independent, non-independent, full-time, etc. Having one woman director. So one good news, at the same time bad news is that woman director can be independent or non-independent. So probably we will find all the family members coming onto the board. I personally don't know how, to what extent the purpose will get served if woman director is not necessarily independent director, but then that is what it is under the law. The woman director needs to be appointed by listed company, but that woman director can be In terms of committees, nomination committee, remuneration committee, stakeholders relationship committee, there was some confusion that audit committee can be constituted within 1 year, but similar provision was not there for other committees. So one view was that since audit committee 1 year is given, similar meaning can be taken for other committees. Another view was that since there is specific provision for audit committee constitution, 1 year transition provision, and hence probably it is purposefully they have not given the time for remuneration and other committees. Again, I think yesterday or the day before there was a circular that 1 year time extends to all committees. Shareholders approval, there are additional at least 12 to 15 areas where shareholders approval was not required in the 1956 Act, but definitely required under the 2013 Act. Loan investment, related party transaction, whether we work in the capacity of auditors, internal auditor, in-house, team members of the company concerned. This is one area which probably calls for extensive work in terms of 185, 186, 188, and then rectification or streamlining of existing practices or transactions. And somewhere I think the transfer pricing aspects will also come in play, because how do you establish an arm's length price, and that probably need to be matched with what action or what positioning has been done from or taken from the tax point of view. So all those you need to sit with even your tax department in terms of establishing that what is an arm's length price, because there cannot be two interpretation in terms of one position in tax and one in Companies Act. There are series of disclosures which are necessarily to be put up on the website, because in 1956 Act probably nobody would have thought of emails, website, etc. So we don't have any provision, if I can say so, under the 1956 Act which calls for disclosures on the website, but there are series of provisions that we need to kind of have a separate referencer and put up on our website, or the company's website. Additional documents, policies. So whether it's committee charter, CSR policy, risk management policy, review policy, board evaluation policy, there are series of policy which we need to either modify, because the schedule to the Companies Act and the rules prescribe the broad contours of those policies, and some of the points which are not there or which are probably not in conformity with those contours, and to that extent we need to even modify the existing policies, and those modified policies need to be approved at the respective committee and board level. Additional government approval. Now again, one example of how smartly, probably on the right side, the Act has gone forward. Minority squeeze out is one of the very commonly used structure, that if the minority is sitting out in the company, how do you buy out minority? One way to go to the court and reduce their capital, selective capital reduction as we call it. But is there any simpler route? Very simple. Companies have increased their face value from 10 to 50,000 by passing simply a shareholder resolution. So all those shareholders who hold shares less than 50,000, they are left with fractional entitlements and they are paid off. You pass a resolution, pay them off, and all shareholders are out. Is it a prudent practice? We can have yes and no, but Act is very clear that you can't do so. So whichever activity you do, in whatever name, whether as part of a formal scheme or otherwise, if any of our action results, and these are the language, these are the words used in the section, if any of these action has the potential change of the relative shareholding of the existing shareholders, that particular activity needs approval of High Court or NCLT or CLT as may be applicable. So we cannot do any such transactions, whether specifically covered in a particular section or not, because there is one omnibus clause or section which say that any activity which results in potential change in the shareholding, you need to have board approval. So all those structural devices probably will not work in 2030 regime. Mapping of compliances in the new act, by and large, we discussed in terms of board resolution filing, special resolution, etc., etc. And I think the more important point is we can add many more points, but broadly I think we need to sensitize all involved, whether as part of management team, the audit team, the professionals involved in whichever capacity, that there has to be a different kind of compliance culture. Board has to affirm compliance of all the application laws, applicable laws of a particular company. Now think of a board of, let's say, Ratan Tata or Birla sitting in the boardroom, how he or the board collectively confirms that all the laws have been complied with. And that's where I think we get into the system part. I have identified 10 control points or systems, not necessarily that they emanate as compliance points, but for us to ensure compliance, we need to have that system in place. CSR, for example, you have CSR policy, you have CSR committee, you have CSR spend, and you finally disclose in the annual report, comply or explain. If you have done, it's fine, otherwise you explain. But how does a company which has, let's say, 50 crore of CSR amount a year reach up to that level? Who will initiate? Who will monitor? Which are those entities and who will approve that yes, these are the 10 entities where you can make use of your CSR spend? What are the authority levels? At what periodicity the report should go from where to where? So there has to be a complete CSR structure in place, like how we have for other business transactions, that yes, this is the CSR structure. That probably will travel much beyond the compliance part, but for us to have that compliance piece in place, we need to have that CSR structure. Board processes, by and large, I think we discussed. Compliance system. Some companies have some online portals where all the systems are tracked, but probably need to review because key managerial person is affirming, CEO is affirming, board is affirming, and finally the auditor and the second auditor are affirming that all the applicable provisions of all the laws, state, central, rules, excise, finance, economic, labor, factories, series of acts. So probably extensive exercise is involved to conform to this requirement of affirmation to statutory compliances. Related party transactions monitoring. So I think the first starting point would be to map first of all that what all are related parties for various purposes. For accounting standard, for companies act, for listing agreement. Because somewhere I think the definitions are not matching. Or even though they are matching, companies act talks of only the defined related party transactions. Somewhere there is no definition, any kind of transaction with the related party is covered. So for various purposes, we need to map and then probably see that whether we want to have a particular transaction or have a particular entity covered or left out, and then how that is possible within the four corners of law. And then going forward, how do we monitor or control those transactions so that none of the transactions fall foul of a particular provision from both law and accounting point of view. Risk management, for the first time in the Companies Act, now they talk about risk management policy. So what is risk is very subjective. Generally companies have policies for derivative hedging and financial treasury operations, but I think risk goes much beyond your treasury and finance risk. It could be finance, it could be business, it could be operations, it could be personal, HR, it could be any kind of risk, and I think a complete risk management system, a culture has to be put in place, and then only board will be in a position to affirm that company has a suitable or adequate risk management system in place. Pecuniary transactions with independent directors and auditors. lot of queries are there. Holding company director, subsidiary company director, common, independent director. So can that common director be termed as independent director, since there is a provision in the Act or the rules that the director should not have any pecuniary relationship from the company or the holding company. So the whole point is, the right interpretation would be that director should not have pecuniary relationship or an earning other than the director fee or remuneration. So in the capacity of independent director, if he is earning fee or remuneration, that in any case is allowed. So over and above, if he or she takes some monetary kind of earning, then the person is disqualified. Otherwise, even if he is a common director, it's fine. And the endorsement comes from the listing agreement that in terms of material subsidiaries, there has to be necessarily a common independent director on the boards of holding and subsidiary company. So how do you marry both the provisions if you don't read it that way? So like that, there are a lot of issues involved. And finally, the visual mechanism, which is like what we have kind of listing agreement also. And a lot of times, this act probably wants to be a self-sustained parliamentary legislation, and that's where we find now two parallel set of provisions as far as listed companies are concerned. So whether we have provision for insider trading, whether we have provision for restriction on derivative trading, whether this visual mechanism, independent directors. So probably we need to marry. SEBI has done that exercise recently, and they have kind of tried to remove those ambiguities, but still I think there are some places where some of the provisions don't match. So we have to simply take stricter of the two and then go about it, so both the sets of provisions are complied with. So I think this is probably what I thought probably the transition management in terms of approach to identification, to kind of having a different culture, and then boiling down to some specific actions. And still some of us seek time, because that's how probably we are tuned to work with. So these are fortunately or unfortunately the time gap which is available. What is the time period for activities not covered specifically? There is no answer. There are a lot of ambiguities in terms of transition period specified in respect of one item but not for the similar item. So we need to be probably geared up for that. And some of the clarifications can be expected, but otherwise wherever is not specified, it is immediate or on real-time basis. So, thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions if there are any.
Line of independent directors regarding the retirement rotation. Since many companies have started adopting the practice of appointing all the directors, and some companies have started the practice of appointing who are retired by rotation regarding the independent directors, and which are following under section 160.
And you need to require to deposit 1 lakh rupees. So how it has to be taken the 4 lakh rupees.
The way the provision goes is that the Act says that independent director can be appointed up to a period of 5 years. So the first question which was posed, which is being posed is it necessary that they should be appointed for 5 years? Or since the word up to is mentioned, they can be appointed for lesser number of years. Now there is a clarification from ministry that you can appoint for less than 5 years, but independent director can be appointed only for